Hello and welcome to this DRJ online virtual session exclusive from Veeam and Converge Technology Solutions, as well as the Converge Enterprise Cloud. Asking yourself, is ransomware your next disaster? So let's plan for recovery now. Here's a look at our abstract here. We don't need to tell you, you're in the DRJ community. You know that there's a lot of threats to your data. Here's a data point from IDC highlighting that there are a lot of attacks, a lot of risks, and really the last couple of months haven't made it any easier to protect data. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. My name is Rick Vanover. I'm from Veeam Software, and I'm joined by Steve. How you doing, Steve?
Hey, doing well there, Rick. Thanks.
And so, Steve, you're VP of North America at the Converge Enterprise Cloud. Tell me a little bit about your expertise.
Well, focus is really backup and protection, as well as disaster recovery and sprinkling managed services around all the things that we deliver. So our focus is really making sure organizations are protected and can overcome a ransomware attack or any type of disaster for that matter.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I really equate ransomware as a disaster because a lot of the response mechanisms that organizations are going to need to put into play look a lot like some of the fire, flood, and blood scenarios that might be out there today. So that's kind of the inspiration of what we want to talk about here today. And my role at Veeam on the product strategy team, I work a lot with the ransomware side of things, and that's inspired our content here today for you. So to kind of set the stage, we've prepared a few kind of anecdotal stories. We don't want to drop some customer names, but Steve, tell us kind of some of the things you're seeing with ransomware in the field.
Well, it's certainly at an all-time high in terms of the amount of attacks and what our customers are having to deal with. Especially, I've got two listed here. The flooring manufacturer I'm highlighting here actually had an attack where all of a sudden their data was gone. All their backup data was destroyed, just deleted. So again, they found themselves in a world of hurt after the ransomware attack, and all I can say is it was rather lengthy restoration and trying to restore from a lot of old tapes because of the fact that, again, their local backup as well as their offsite backup that was tied in electronically in terms of network-wise, all of it was deleted. So rather painful recovery effort for them. And then I've got another organization, we'll call it Organization B, Denver-based retailer. I'll never forget, it was a Friday afternoon. I was at the house, it was about 6 o'clock Eastern, and I got a phone call from somebody out of our Denver office saying, hey, we just had a customer just taken down by ransomware, and they don't want to pay the ransom, but boy, they need inventory, they need assets quickly in order to start rebuilding their entire environment. So we literally quick shipped all the hardware assets. We're talking servers, network, and storage infrastructure, had it there on Sunday. So that was Friday at 6. At Sunday, they started the restoration process. Very long, lengthy 5-day restore process. But again, very painful because of the fact they were not protected.
Greenfield in 36 hours. That does not sound like an easy weekend. Interesting.
No, not whatsoever.
And you bring up a good point, Steve. A lot of the threat actors are very aware on when they strike on a Friday, right? People don't want to deal with it on the weekend. It might seem easier just to pay the ransom. Right before a lot of the holidays in the U.S., we see strike points. We had it right at 4th of July here in the U.S., if you remember that one.
Yes.
Here at Veeam, I've seen a few things too. I'll show you one example that was raised to me just this month. A property management firm had 100% data recovery because they did the preparation. They had all of the different advices that experts like Steve and what we're doing here at Veeam, they have all of those different advices incorporated in their resiliency plan. So I'm trying to tell you the outcome can be good. You can recover from ransomware, but there are some steps you need to do, and you need to be prepared to change the plan. Another organization that I was familiar with, I had a debrief of a ransomware incident with them. Again, 100% data recovery. I love hearing those types of stories. So I pay really good attention when things don't go well, and I take what was the lesson learned there. I pivot that to actionable advice, which I'm going to share with you here in a second, so that we don't have those types of problems in market. But this particular organization was able to drive recovery from storage snapshots. Great. but turns out they got lucky. And that's one thing we want to think about. We don't want to have luck as part of the recipe for success. So, and if we were having this, this chat in the room here, we'd all be aware of some of the dynamics in our own stories that go into the threat landscape, which again is significant. If I asked each of you to raise your hands, if you've had a ransomware incident, you would be surprised how many people would actually raise their hand. I haven't had to do that in about a year, Steve. So I have an opportunity later this month to do an in-person presentation on it. Hopefully, I get a more optimistic data point, but the threat is real. So let me kind of walk you through something, a perspective here, a little bit of history. And it's somewhat debatable on when the very first ransomware it was. There's been some floppy disk, things and the like. One of the earlier modes even was, identified as early as 1989, right, which goes way back. And some of the more recent ones, even through the last decade, became large-scale anonymous deployment and payment methods. Some of the other modern technologies have paved the way for a low barrier of entry for some of these threat actors, and it's multiplied. And today you can get ransomware as a service or toolkits to help do it and scale it. And there's, networks and partnerships, there's QA, there's all kinds of things. There's dark web channels to move advice and information on these areas and these threats. And then, threat actors enabling other threat actors go as part of the threatscape. And we all know this, right? It's a very bad world out there the closer you look. I spend a lot of time researching everything I can about ransomware and continually adjusting my advice to really give people confidence that we have the ways to recover data today. Now, what's interesting here is, okay, it's out there, I know, but how is it my problem? That's kind of a natural question I get from a lot of people. And the reality is there's some common methods of entry, right? Some of them you might have thought of, some of them you haven't thought of, and I'll get to some, we'll call it COVID era special versions of this. But basically, email Trojans, basically emails that look like there's something, but they're actually not. And this is actually very relevant nowadays. You don't always know the parties that you're dealing business with nowadays. Yeah, think about that, right? You don't have a similar understanding of their email behavior, right? There might be a bad attachment, or their endpoint is taken over and it becomes the deployment method through it. Trojan is someone you do trust. Watch out for that too. So it might be someone you trust, but the content might not be the right look and feel. Removable media is another very popular way to get in. Removable drives, USB sticks, that type of stuff. You might have seen the one about the mouse hardware that was big news recently for a deployment mechanism, escalation of privilege situation, bad advertising, and actually social media and SMS. Actually, this is interesting. QR codes might go into this one as well. Text message, WhatsApps, those types of things is the ways in. And kind of a mindset I like to think with all these different, mechanisms, the bad guys only have to be right once. The good guys, you, me, and everyone listening to this, we have to be right 100% of the time, right? But think about this battle that we're facing. Now, I've also seen some really interesting things nowadays, and remote work has absolutely had an impact on this. In fact, I have a slide on that here in a second. But basically, if you think about what people had to deal with, say March of last year, around remote work and remote access, real simple. People had to make a change, and they had to do it right, or they had to do it right now. Well, you know what it was last year. It was you had to do it right now. So there are a lot of people that took a lot of shortcuts. And if you haven't closed those loops, I'm going to show you some data that'll scare you in that regard. So think about remote work. Exfiltration is the latest type of behavior for some of these threat actors. Exfiltration, or DocX, or TripX as sometimes it's called, is basically taking your data and selling it on the dark web, or even selling it back to the clients that it is their data of. Interesting. But nonetheless, we need to make sure that we know when data leaves a network. Now, another observable is that dwell time remains high. Dwell time is when ransomware likes to sit, assess, and enhance the scare tactics. I was aware of one threat actor that took over the printers, was printing out the ransom notes to scare end users, right? Think about some of those crazy things that they can do. Because again, they looked on the network and found the printers and scripting out a print command is pretty easy. There's also new threat vectors that are specific to nowadays, some of the newer work models. I like to watch one of the YouTube videos I've got a link to at the end here. They showed the new Discord ransomware. Now, Discord, you may or may not be using it. Slack, false sharing with like OneDrive shares or Dropbox links. Those are potential phish modes of entries, but they look like normal behaviors that you might be having. These are interesting to watch. The Discord one in particular, because the ransom is to buy a coffee. It's incredibly cheap. My warning here is this isn't the script kiddie type stuff that we used to deal with. I think it's basically practicing in QA cycles with some of these threat actors. But then the other kind of observables, a lot of organizations struggle with reporting. And what I mean by that is, do they tell their boss? Do they tell the legal authorities? Do they report it to their stakeholders? Give some thought to that. There's no single answer. And post-incident improvements are an incredible lesson learned in today's world. So all of that being said, there's a lot that I've seen going on. And what I do here at Veeam is I talk to a lot of customers. We analyze ransomware incidents. We survey people. And last year we did a ransomware survey. And we see a lot of people have gone through ransomware. Veeam has a lot of customers, global network, global deployments, et cetera. And we ask them, what are they doing to prevent a ransomware incident from being business disruptive in the future? Now, this was a survey across our audience and non-users. Okay, so this is just market data. Veeam's that's a different story for another day, but Veeam's really good at getting market data. But anyways, believe it or not, the number one thing that people are doing is investing in end user education. Now, this is interesting, Steve. It's a non-technical fix. And if you think about what an email that's bogus looks like, should you click on this? Should you use this coffee network Wi-Fi or whatever? End user education is, believe it or not, I would actually believe, should you put this random USB drive into the file server? Should you charge your phone from the data center USB server port? Probably not. End user education is likely, it matches our data, but I would actually challenge it's one of the more effective mechanisms to help prevent ransomware. People will then invest in also their storage resiliency, their security, bits, detection, all the way on down the line. But the reality is when it comes to some of these threats, you don't know exactly what you're going to be dealing with. And, this was a global survey, big, little companies, everything in between, but aggregating it all down, end user education, backup storage resiliency, and securing the internet access is really important. Flipping that around, how did they get into that problem? Same survey, different question. Where did ransomware come from? Now, any of you that are good at math know that this adds up to more than 100. Sometimes they don't know, sometimes it's multiple, and that's important because sometimes a threat actor will work with two different mechanisms to put a bigger solution together, right? It might come in via phish email, but then might start behaving differently through an SMS, or it might come in through SMS and exploit itself through remote access, you name it. Now, when we did this survey in 2020 in the third quarter, 60% came in through spam email, 21%, let's go laser mode here, 60% came in through spam email, 21% came in through remote desktop access. A vulnerability or an update were identified 15% of the time, and then Trojans, which come through email usually, 20% of the time. Now, when we look at the same question a couple years ago, in 2018, spam was 48%. Now it's 60. Remote access was 5%. Now it's 21. So that had a huge growth. Veeam has observed a huge growth in remote access exploits for ransomware introduction. But the reality is, this is also confirmed by another, a fairly credible resource. And, Coveware is one of the go-tos I go to for ransomware information. So Coveware has this, I call it a long tail tracker. They track it for a number of years here. where does ransomware, function from an attack vector perspective? And this was the April 2021 POV. So basically Q1. This is a little bit old, but I think, look at this, Steve, right here. The dark blue is remote desktop. And then into 2021, look at that jump just with remote. I mean, I'm sure you guys were impacted with working from home last year. Is that right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then ransomware followed the trend, right? And then look at email phishing. It actually went down. Now it almost invertedly takes this gain. I thought that was very interesting. And then vulnerabilities, they creep up. Now that's an interesting one. I actually challenge that a lot of organizations are slipping on some of their day-to-day maintenance things because of blame it on the pandemic, right? But if you think about keeping systems up to date, so software vulnerability would be that red line. Having remote access done well, which would be that dark blue line. Training on email phishing, which would be the light blue line. I mean, that's got to be 90% of the threat vector, right? So if you need like some real specific advice for the market, look at these three things. Get those three things right. We're supposed to be doing that stuff right anyways, right? So I think, again, whatever you look at, if you look at the Verizon data breach incident report, the Coveware information, the Veeam data, and you name it, I guarantee you it's going to be real consistent or otherwise generally aligning to this. Okay, so what do you do with this information? Okay, the people listening to this are usually part of a technology organization that have, some responsibilities for data and DR and resiliency. That's why you're a member of DRJ. And what I want to do now is actually pivot a little bit from some advice from people that deal with it every day. Believe it or not, Steve, you're experts, I'm sure, deal with incidents of all types every day when organizations need places to restore or recover data. Our support team, same thing. But there's a dedicated group at Veeam that is really specialized on ransomware recovery. And it's handled differently. We call it the SWAT team, SWAT standing for somewhat above a tier. And the thought here is it's a high priority matter. We really need to treat this well because everything's on the line. So I talk to this group often. We go and I'm based here in Central Ohio. We have a support center here for the Americas. Talk to them when they're in. Otherwise, have a call with them, but very much locked in on the latest advice. Now, I realize not everyone here is going to be using Veeam, but I'm going to give you some ransomware specific advice that can help you no matter what you're doing. Number one, when I talk to organizations via the support team in my own consultations, when they cannot drive data recovery from a ransomware scenario, the number one reason, for as long as I've been researching this, is that they did not follow the 3-2-1 rule and have what I call an ultra resilient copy of data. What that means, and I'll explain ultra resilient here in a second, the 3-2-1 rule is a great way to start. Having 3 different copies of data on 2 different types of media with 1 copy being off-site. Now I'm going to double down on that here in a second, but that's a real simple way that you can approach data management, and the off-site is the very important part, because when it comes to ransomware, you may not trust where you are recovering to if it's the same place that you backed up from. Now, let me explain. Sometimes if you have a ransomware incident and you engage a cybersecurity response team, maybe local or government technology officials for this type of stuff, you might not be able to touch the source environment. So you might have to go somewhere else, okay? So again, think of the offsite, think of the ultra resiliency. This is the number one piece of advice, the 3-2-1 rule. Number two piece of advice that I've seen consistently in debriefing from some professionals who deal with ransomware on a daily basis. Organizations have done the first thing above, but they lost their encryption passwords. Oh no, I got my data, but I don't have my encryption key. And when I say encryption, I'm talking about the good encryption. I grew up knowing that every time I would put data off-site or put a tape in a truck, it should be encrypted. And that's still a good practice today. I would say if you're going to put data in the cloud, you should encrypt it or somebody else will. And the logic here is that if you've encrypted your backups stored off-site, you need to have access to your encryption password to drive recovery. Now, this quickly gets a Veeam example because Veeam backups are completely self-describing. I can just have the backups and drive recovery to a service provider cloud or to a new kit really easily, but we see consistently a lot of organizations not maintaining their passwords. Third is not having separate accounts. You might remember that anecdotal one that I started with. The organization had offline copies, separate accounts. That was very critical in driving their recovery. When people use domain administrator for everything or a privileged account for both source and target backup functions, that's not a good day. So I always recommend to have different accounts for every function. Next, moving swiftly along, is using multi-factor authentication everywhere you can. It's a great mechanism to fend off some of the threat actors. Here's a COVID special. We've seen a lot of organizations that use tape if their staff are working from home. Well, guess what? They're not taking tapes out of the library. Well, guess what? If the threat actor takes over the network, they can take over the tape drive and start wiping tapes. So, you think tape is a really resilient specimen, think again when you think about current conditions. And the last one here is an interesting one. I've seen a lot of organizations struggle on what to do. So I'll actually give a slight exception to state and local government, at least in the US. I feel like they have pretty good incident response plans, but the private sector doesn't. Knowing what to do when something goes wrong, if you don't even have expertise on hand, they'll say, hey, I'm going to fail over to my DR plan. Well, first of all, I ask the question, do you have a DR plan? Do I have decision authority, or do I have stakeholders? Do I even know who to call? These are the things that actually can slow you down like days right here. All right, swiftly moving along. Testing restores, not knowing that you can actually recover your data. Sounds obvious, but still a problem nowadays. That's not a time to find out about storage corruption. It does border under the 3-2-1 rule. And then actually, this was a very interesting one, the Ready Console, I call it. I spoke to an organization who was really a fan of DR, disaster recovery. They took it seriously. And they intentionally kept what I call a Ready Console at their DR site. And they were using a service provider where they had infrastructure as a service that was planned to be their disaster recovery site, but they had a Veeam console up there just doing nothing on purpose. And the thought was, when an incident happened, that was a ready to go environment with the passwords, not the same, but available, where they could log in and drive recoveries quickly. Again, having portable data. So anyways, these are just some interesting tips and tricks. Does anything stick out to you, Steve, on that list, or anything interesting?
No, I think you've covered it well.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is timeless advice, Veeam or not. You can translate this to everything you're doing. And here's my 3-2-1 rule, and I've upgraded it a little bit. So the 3-2-1 rule, as I mentioned, when it was born, was having 3 different copies of data, 2 different types of media, one of which being offsite. Put in context some of the threats to your data today. I'm now recommending to have 1 copy that's also offline, air-gapped, or immutable. That's what I call ultra resilient. That's your ransomware, shield of sorts. And then also have no surprises by doing recovery verification. Now, those of you quickly think, well, this is starting to look like a zip code. That's right, Central Florida, they got it right. But the reality is, this is a very efficient way to be resilient against ransomware. So let me double down on what I mean by offline, immutable, and air-gapped or otherwise ultra-resilient copies. Now, I would go so far as to say that this is by far the most resilient specimen against ransomware, coupled with that advice of the 3-2-1-1-0 rule. Those 2 things put together can give you very high confidence that you can recover data, but if that's still enough, stay tuned. I got something up my sleeve. So here's the deal. When I look at the market that I see today, there are a lot of ways that you can, presumably keep data safe. The old school way is tape. In fact, tape, everybody's got a story of tape letting them down, myself included. But there's some really interesting characteristics, right? You could have a worm media tape write once, read many, have that removed from the library, that right there is offline, immutable, and air gapped all at once. It's a really resilient specimen. Low cost of acquisition, high portability, but it's kind of hard to make the case to do that if you're not in tape already. So that's why we're in a good situation with the technology landscape today with a lot of other options. So I'm actually going to start at the bottom and work at the top. So Veeam and a lot of other solutions have immutable file system options or hardened repositories. That's the Veeam specific term, hardened repositories, which is using immutability flags for data that's a backup written onto a file system. That's a really good specimen. The quick best practice is keep that not connected to the internet, keep those root credentials completely different, separated, don't log in as root. And then, at least in the Veeam implementation, Veeam does one little bit better and doesn't maintain a persistent connection. So you have a really good sense of, integrity of that data when you write it, that you can drive recoveries. Now, some people like to use hyperscale public cloud or on-premises S3 compatible storage systems. One of the good things about this whole S3 and S3 compatible storages is that there's built-in immutability with something called governance and compliance mode with the object lock capability. A lot of products, Veeam included, support that in the hyperscale public cloud or on-premises unified storage systems, right? You don't have to do the public cloud to do that. Or there's even, I don't know, Steve, do you guys offer any public S3 storages? I should have checked ahead of time.
Yes, we do.
There we go.
We certainly do.
There you go.
We
So
do.
there is an option right there from a service provider. You don't necessarily have to go to the hyperscale public cloud. Offline hard drives. But then there's the secret weapon right here in the middle that I want to call Veeam Cloud Connect backups. And, I'll probably get some feedback for this, but I'd argue this is one of the most resilient techniques out there in the market today to help you protect yourself against ransomware, but also some other phenomena that we've even called insider protection and insider threats. So the reality is this is a completely out of band copy of your backup data, and it's really kept for you so that you have very high level of confidence, whether it's accidental deletion, malicious administrator, or ransomware. So, and the hot tip here is that Steve has a whole group that provides this type of service that can help you out with that. And we'll talk about that here in a second. All right.
Hey, Rick.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I'd like to jump in here.
Yeah.
You mentioned it several times relative to how perpetrators with ransomware get the process started and how all of a sudden through the network, it really becomes wreaks havoc on a business. And that case study that I used, that first example of the flooring company, that's exactly what happened. Open port, perpetrator got in through that port. Port was left open because of COVID for remote users to make it easier for remote user access. Next thing you know, though, not only did they hit the organization with the ransomware, but they came through the network and deleted the backup data. So everything you have here is spot on. And again, just because your data is off-site, and if it's network attached, it does not give you the protection that Rick is talking about here. So I'm glad you covered all of these topics.
The threat actors know that your number one way to recover is backups. So you have to build your backups in a mode. You're exactly right, Steve. You have to build your backups, which can build your DR plan, which can build your resilience plan, which can build your business continuity operations. You have to build this with the threat in mind. And so right off the bat, having these immutable copies, however they may be in place, are absolutely required today. So 5 steps: update everything. I like to say everyone is on the cybersecurity team, right? So do threat analysis with them and get on number 3, everyone involved, and have your backups and send copies off site, right? Some of these advice, they can turn practical and integrate your cybersecurity teams, align to your business response teams, etc. So I want to put this in a context of what Veeam is telling some of the customers today. So I've given you some insight of the threat behavior, some universal truths on how to recover data. But like in the Veeam world, sponsors of DRJ, what's a practical way you could do that? So what I've done here, Steve, is I've really simplified the view. So, which, for the audience here, wouldn't you love things to be as simple as 3 little squares? But The reality is that's not the case today. What I'm showing you here is just the simple view of the Veeam backup storage. So this is, your data center, your PCs, laptops being backed up and stored in a simple example on premises, and 3-2-1 rule, have a copy off site. So what I've done here is I've actually given you the 3-2-1 rule with the mutability in both places. So what I mean by that is, let's start with that immutable Linux target for on-premises backup. That's my first copy. I want to have high-speed increments and high-speed restores, so that makes sense to have it on site. But I also should have something off-site. Again, we still have to worry about fire, flood, and blood. But if we go off-site, say Veeam Cloud Connect, maybe you're a single site organization. You don't have a secondary data center. There's a whole global network, and Steve has some time here in a second to talk about that, of options to put your backup data off-site. I really love Cloud Connect because, again, with insider protection, which is that little shadow copy of sorts, it's not a Windows shadow copy, but it's a in the shadows type of copy of your data. The end users and the threat actors can't manipulate that data. So what you have here is immutability start to finish, and this is very powerful. So imagine your day-to-day practice. For those of you watching this session, my first copy of backups on site, I'm going to mark that as immutable, but I'm also going to have an ultra resilient copy off-site, hosted in a service provider where I don't have to invest in that second site cost. And the beautiful thing is that Cloud Connect with insider protection, it meets my criteria of being ultra resilient. But what's better is that it's a completely different storage control plane. So what's happening here is, again, this is just a view of the Veeam backup data. I'm actually assuming that everything on premises is compromised. The threat actors have taken over the Veeam console. The threat actors have taken over my Active Directory domain, app servers, file servers. It's a bad day. But if I have this backup data, and if I have it marked with the immutability on premises with the hard Linux repository, and a second, so double play immutability, it's still baseball season, with the Veeam Cloud Connect copy of the backup. And then if you're still a little paranoid, you can go triple play and have a job out to a tape or another cloud. Friends, this is a very resilient specimen that you can have very high confidence that you can recover data, because all three of these copies of the data have the ultra resilient characteristics, completely different storage control planes. In the copies that matter, there's no persistent connection back to the Veeam server. This is the way, friends. Multiple copies, throw in immutability all along the way. And Steve, I know Cloud Connect is part of the business offering that you guys have, but this also can solve a real problem. Sometimes people don't trust where they're coming from. And, if I needed a cluster to restore to, could you, come up with something like that for me?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what we do, and we do it every day.
Yeah. So, when you plan for disaster in the market, if on premises just isn't an option, maybe you didn't take my bait on the tape out. But that service provider copy is there, is completely self-describing copy of your data. And there's other techniques about, well, what if the ransomware sat in there and dwelled and all that for a bit? We've got an answer for that as well. But the reality is these data labs become a part of your recovery technique to answer some of those questions. Will I reintroduce the threat? Well, why not use a technique that Veeam's had in market for a number of years to power on these workloads and make sure that they're going to function as expected? And that could be manually or automated, or from storage snapshots, or from backups. There's a lot of different ways to go about that. The other angle, and this is really cool stuff, by the way, is the Veeam Secure Restore capability. So let's talk dwell. Let's say that something comes into the environment and is been backed up, but we don't have a response for it from our anti-malware tool, for example. And then let's say that now we have the behavior observed and data is being encrypted and things like that. But here's day zero, right? We've got problems before we have solutions, right? The good news is that Veeam has a capability called Secure Restore that will allow you to, after the attack, yet also after the antivirus or the anti-malware tool is aware of these threats, we could actually recover data with a scrub. Very, very powerful technique here, because sometimes you run this risk of dwell and remediation not necessarily aligning in times. So the Secure Restore, the Data Lab are two of the many different ways, just two examples I wanted to highlight here with Veeam, that you can actually get to a clean restoration point. Because I speak to a lot of organizations that are like, well, I need immutability for 6 months. I actually challenge, no, you don't. You probably only need immutability for about 2 weeks. Because if you're restoring your whole business from 6 months ago, you're going to have different problems. The reality is long-term retention is for compliance reasons. Immutability is to get you out of a hard problem. And Secure Restore used in conjunction with that will really help you out. Here's another view of what Secure Restore does, because sometimes it may catch the threat, but you're given an option. Do I abort the recovery, or do I power it on but not connect it to the network? Or if it scans clean, do I throw it back into the network? These types of options really help your recovery plans. And the last thing is that insider protection. I had it simplified before, but trust me, there's a lot of technology behind the scenes that makes it easy for the market to consume an ultra resilient backup. But on the back end, from the service provider perspective, there's some really good intelligence going on with this copy of data. So if I have this backup copy sent offsite, it kind of exists twice already, and you don't even know that. But whether you have that malicious employee or fill in the blank, some random ransomware come and delete backups, this virtual recycle bin is in place that is basically the user copy that you don't see. So if there's an incident, we'd have to, if we had a service provider like Steve and his peers, we'd call and have to like expose that type of data. It'd take, 4 eyes to do that, because Steve's team would have to do it, as with the customer requesting it, right? So it's not an accidental thing. Good stuff. And the last thing on the Veeam side I'll highlight is just, one of the ways you can go about this is the new Veeam Orchestrator product. Using all of this advice together can really streamline and automate this. This is something, gives you some stress-free recovery with ease. All right, so I talked about a lot of different ransomware stuff, resources and stuff. Now, these are the places that I go to learn about ransomware. The CrowdStrike Cyber Frontlines report. This is a really good, kind of one of the newer data sources that I've been finding. Again, it's still confirming remote access, spam email, phish email, and updates as top modes of entry, right? Different view of the same data, confirming it. But again, if you focus on those 3 things, you'll really make a big positive imprint. Virus Total is a website where you can do heuristics on something that's suspicious. I love to kind of look and see, put it through. It basically does file DNA. Does it have touches of some of the known threats? Coveware, I showed you that one chart, but they've got great blogs and other materials about this. And there we can also, there are 2 different things. One is just their top level site, and then the link to the current view of the threat vectors. And then I'm giving away all my secrets here, Steve. I love the PC security channel. Leo, the founder of this YouTube channel, just to give you, for the audience some perspective. There's one YouTube channel I subscribe to. It's this one. I don't even subscribe to Veeam, and maybe I'll get in trouble for that. But basically, the PC security channel, this individual, Leo, and his team, they will demonstrate the ransomware for you. If you want to see what the new Discord ransomware looks like, how it encrypts, but also how the different anti-malware tools stop it, detect it, isolate it, respond to it. You got to watch this stuff, friends. This is amazing. You don't want to find out from a help desk or a text message from your peer, hey, what's this mean on my computer screen? Go watch Leo's cuts of this. Highly recommend that resource. And then what we've done at Veeam is really work to bring a lot of content to the market here. And I just finished my ransomware paper. This goes very Veeam specific, but I'm trying to highlight all the knowledge I have on it. And There's a lot. But the reality is we need help to do it. You need your data, you need your users, you need your data center. But sometimes, like I said, you can't trust your data center and you might need to go somewhere else. And so, Steve, kind of tell me the ransomware resiliency story from your lens of view.
Well, really, if you look back, it was all about recovery. And certainly COVID has sped us up into this age of resiliency. As organizations worked last year to, again, change the way in which they were doing business, a lot has occurred in terms of making sure that organizations are solid on the resiliency side, because that's what it's all about, especially as it comes down to data protection. And I want to say, as a professional in the industry for quite some time, being part of DRJ, personally for many, many years, Veeam, I've not really seen a product like Veeam and what Veeam brings to the table. And that's why I thought it was really important that we, as Converged Enterprise Cloud, as part of the DRJ ecosystem, kind of let Veeam share what's new on the ransomware side and what they actually bring to the market to help organizations that deal with ransomware and other vulnerabilities and malware, and again, making sure that their environments are resilient. And that's really what we do. And I like to say that kind of Veeam casts a net across the technology environment to protect the environment. The insider protection, for example, the company I mentioned out of Chicago that was hit with the ransomware, had they enacted and enabled the insider protection, that would have given them the layer of protection they needed to avoid what happened in terms of losing all their data, because we would have had another copy of their data that they could have restored from. So it's all about resiliency, and that's really where our focus is today, especially with the DRJ community, staying focused on resiliency. In terms of just, Rick, as we close here, really just wanted to provide kind of a foundation on who Converge, who we are, and why Veeam is so important to us. If you look at our national footprint, we're made up of 23 different companies that have been acquired in the last 2.5 years. What an incredible feat. All of these organizations in just under 3 years. So we've amassed a great deal of technology resources in terms of our relationship as well with Veeam is just been rock solid. We're a platinum partner with Veeam. But in terms of just technical resources, regardless of what organizations need, that's where we're very strong in terms of over 1,400 employees, but 450 technical resources at our customers' disposal. A lot of different areas that we focus in on: cybersecurity, advanced analytics, for example, cloud, all the cloud components, whether it's the public cloud, the private cloud, or our enterprise cloud, as we call it today. But we cast a very wide net as it relates to all things technology, and especially providing resiliency solutions for our customers. In terms of what we focus on every day, and Rick, you mentioned some of these components in helping our organizations and our the various customers, whether it's managed services and wrapping services for backup and or recovery, whether it's infrastructure as a service, and continuity consulting. Again, with our team within the DRJ, we provided a lot of resources in terms of providing consulting resources for DR plan development, even tabletop exercises for ransomware protection. We had one very large organization that we went through a desktop process with them, taking them through the events of what would happen had they been hit with ransomware, only to find that at the end they were going to pay the ransom through this exercise because they did not have the proper implementation in place as it relates to data protection, as well as DR infrastructure that they could restore to in a timely fashion, because again, their business works on minutes, not days, in terms of data accessibility and data availability. All that to say, at the end of this exercise, they were going to pay the ransom, only to find out they didn't even know how to get currency in terms of cryptocurrency. They didn't know at the financial area of their business within the financial community how they were going to even access and get cryptocurrency to pay the ransom. So again, a lot of lessons learned over time. with our customers, and unfortunately with customers that have actually been victims of ransomware. So we bring a lot to bear in terms of what we can do to help organizations be resilient through the services we are sharing with you here today. And last but not least, in terms of being on the forefront with information, this it just illustrates one of our what we call solution briefs as it relates to data protection and Veeam, leveraging Veeam and their insider protection against ransomware, whether it's Veeam Cloud Connect, whether it's Veeam Office 365 and backup protection. Again, you can see the underlying foundation here is all things backup and data protection, and then providing disaster recovery and infrastructure to make sure organizations can be recovered in a timely fashion. And really, that's it for me, Rick. I just was excited to hear your presentation and get a better understanding of all the things that Veeam brings to bear and the things you shared with us about the market itself and where ransomware is and how it's reared its ugly head across all industries. So very exciting and very informative. And Rick, we really appreciate you bringing this to us today.
Well, Steve, no, I appreciate the opportunity. I have been wanting to interlock with the DRJ community for a number of years. Couple things got sorted out. Number one, I got a budget so I can get a sponsorship spot here. And, I really hope I can see everyone in the March event for those who are the regulars there. And, if you have any questions, sometimes this gets specific quickly, right, for your needs, right? Just send a note to me or Steve or, anyone else that you might know from either Converge or Veeam. We'd be happy to talk to you and really get that conversation started. So, no, Steve, thank you so much for your perspective as well. This has been a great opportunity.
No, thanks, Rick. Look forward to seeing you in Orlando.
All right, indeed. I'm not going to book my ticket yet, but I'm going to plan on it for sure.
All right, we'll see you there, Rick.
Indeed, and thank you to the DRJ team. They've done a pretty good adjustment here. I know they've put a lot of work to the new format, so they need a big thanks as well. And really thank you to the attendees. Really appreciate your time. And that concludes today's session.
Yes. Bye for now. Thanks, everyone.